Good evening, everyone. It is so great to be here. My name is Tricia Rose Burt, and I am standing on a stage that had a lot of important people on it, so I'm feeling really blessed to be here. I'm delighted to be here, too, because obviously the evening is all about story, and it is how I earn my keep. It's also what I think is going to be the tool that helps us change and shape our world. When I'm not on stage telling stories, I go around the country teaching storytelling with an organization called the Moth. I spend a lot of time in businesses and organizations, and I work with business leaders and executives to help them tell their personal stories. And I often hear this: I don't have a story to tell. And that usually means nothing important enough has happened to me to share with anyone. Nothing like life-changing or death-defying or something. They don't think their stories are large enough. And I always say, if you got out of bed this morning, you got a story to tell. You just need to learn how to tell the story, right? But I get that, I understand that need or that pressure to feel like whatever you're saying, your story has to be really important and matter and be of significance. I've been telling stories for a while, but one of the first times I told a story was down in New York at the bitter end at a Moth Story Slam. The Moth is an organization based in New York that is dedicated to the art and craft of storytelling. And I was on a Moth Story Slam, and I told a 5-minute story, and it was about how I was in business, didn't like it, kind of snapped, went to art school, and drew from the model, a nude model for the first time. I was very unprepared for that task. I called the story How to Draw a Naked Man, and the Moth seemed to like it because it was kind of funny. And they asked me to come down to New York and tell a larger version of this story on the Moth main stage. Now, this was a big deal, and I was really excited. I was really thrilled, and I sort of hopped in my little Honda Fit and drove on down I-91 from New Hampshire to New York, and I'm thinking, I am going to tell the best story ever. And it was sort of this train wreck of naivete and arrogance as I drove down the road. And I went to the rehearsal, and I met my fellow storytellers, right? And the first storyteller is an international scientist, and he's telling the story of how he was in Sri Lanka tracking the jumping spider during a coup, and there were corpses floating down the river. And the next storyteller talks about how he overcame his cocaine addiction, and then he was in a shipwreck and had to drink his own urine to survive. And a couple of the other stories are the same sort of intensity. And I went to art school. And I'm thinking, this is bad. This is all so bad. And I went to the artistic director, and I said, you have made a horrible mistake. I have no business being on this stage. I did nothing important. I just went to art school. And she said, Tricia, 2 things. First off, do you think we'd let you on that stage if we weren't ready? And secondly, not all stories are extreme, but they need to be told. It's the best direction I've ever been given, and I pass it on to you as well. Because while some of us have, cheated death and, overcome all sorts of things and, death-defying odds, and we salute you for the work that you've done, the rest of us are just kind of regular, and we're just having regular lives out there. And so our stories may not be that big, but they're still important, and small moments can be very deep stories, right? And so here's what makes a story, whether it's a big story, small story, there's some things that make a story work. And there is a difference between a story and an anecdote, I want to point out. An anecdote is, I was great, I went to the store and I was great, I came home and I was great. That is not a good story. Nothing happened in that story, it's a flat story. In a story, something changes. The storyteller changes in that story. Right? We have to see a moment of change. It can be a small change, it can be a big change. I've heard a woman get on stage and tell a story about how she used to take cream in her coffee, now she doesn't take cream in her coffee. It's a small change, good story. I've heard somebody on stage say, they were a man, now they were a woman, much bigger change. also a good story. But both of those stories have change. And somewhere in that continuum are our stories and how we've changed, right? So the key thing about a story is there's a change. And the next thing that makes a good story is vulnerability. And oh my goodness, Anthony just teed me up for this one, man. So, it's great that you climbed Mount Everest. That's very impressive. But what I'm way more interested in is in the moment when you wanted to turn back. Because we all live in this doubt and uncertainty, and we just want to, how'd you figure it out? That's kind of what we want to know. So Anthony had just a terrific example of showing his vulnerability and how he figured that out. That's what we want to know. We want to know what the questions are, right? We don't want to know we don't want to know the big success. We want to know what it took for you to get there, right? And so there's 3 key elements to a story. And our storytellers this evening are going to illustrate these 3 key elements. And the first one is stakes. What's at stake for you? Why does this story matter when you're telling a story? What does it matter? Eva's going to explain that or show us what stakes are. And stakes, again, it's like what can be won, what can be lost. That's what we're thinking about here. Like, why does this matter to you? And it doesn't have to be life or death, right? It could be that you've just moved to town, you're a terrible cook, and you've been put in charge of making the brownies for your 5th grade son's party. And his reputation hinges on the success of those brownies, right? It's not life or death, but it's important. Those stakes are important, right? So the stakes are, why does it matter? What's important? Why do we care? And the second thing that makes a good story is theme. What's the story about? Now, this is different than plot. Plot is what happens in the story. And Naked Man, right, in that story, I didn't like my job in business, and I went to art school, and I drew from a nude model, and then I became an artist. That's what happened in the story. That's the plot. But what the story is about is authenticity. The story is about trying to find out who I really was and stepping into that. So that's the difference, right? So theme, and Gwendolyn is going to show us a story about theme. What's the theme of your story? And the last thing I want to talk about and say is a really important part of storytelling is narrative arc. And Jordan's going to illustrate that for us. A narrative arc is going back to that change, right? It's going back to change. Who were you at the beginning and who were you at the end? And on a narrative arc, you're going to take us through an emotional journey. We're going to travel with you in that story. And it may not be a huge arc, but there's an arc of who you were at the beginning and who you are at the end. So there's 3 things to think about, right? The stakes, theme, the narrative arc. That's what you want to think about when you're telling your own stories or when you're listening to them. And so now we're going to listen to some stories, and we're going to start with Eva.
We immigrants, we learn to carry things. We pack and unpack, and we take our homes with us. I once took a sausage, a Polish sausage, mind you. Might not taste any different from Israeli or American sausage, but it's a Polish sausage. I bought it at the airport in Krakow before I left Poland. It was tightly sealed. I was told it would be okay. And then on the flight, I started to have bad premonitions. So I asked a flight attendant, and she told me to eat it right away. Instead, I fell asleep, only to wake up in time to exit the flight. So I promised myself to throw the sausage out in the nearest bathroom. But I kept walking. I grew up in the communist regime where food was sometimes scarce, so I don't like to waste it. So I kept walking, thinking, if God lets my sausage in, I'll eat it like a saint. Circle a table with Gregorian chants. So when the baggage carousel spurted my luggage out, I looked around and I quickly transferred my sausage from carry-on onto checked luggage. And I kept walking towards customs, praying for my sausage. And the officer pulled me aside. My luggage went through a sausage scan, and he took it out. What is it? It's a sealed sausage, I declared with pride. But you declared no meat. Sealed sausage is not a meat. Sealed sausage is a sealed sausage. He looked puzzled, so I repeated with determination, sealed sausage is a sealed sausage. He looked blinded, as if this hypnotic alliteration threw him back into the waters of his childhood, where eels jiggled Scottish dances. In the end, my sausage got arrested, and I had to promise I understood that sausage was meat. Had it not been confiscated, I would have sent it to the Vatican to become a relic. And this smuggling incident gave me an appetite for more. So I went to Ellis Island to track down the historical objects that immigrants carried with them. And they carried goose feathers, live goats, barrels of pickles, rosaries, honeymoon dresses. There was a Swedish woman who carried a stained sheet used in her families to deliver babies only. She wanted to show it to her new doctor. And then I wondered what were the invisible things that people carried. Albert Sabin, a pauper from Białystok, Poland, carried a live virus, the vaccine that eliminated polio from the United States. Khalil Gibran, an Arab, carried a live virus of poetry, which soon became his famous book, The Prophet. Paula Negri carried the dreams of stardom, and she became a Hollywood star. Irish people carried turf, which I see as a metaphor for identity, and this inspired me to write a poem which later was published in a book called Contraband of Hupo, and you're going to buy it, right? We take the turf with us. We take the dirt with us. We smuggle mortality. We smuggle the dust. We carry the clay. We make the words out of little clumps of earth, where all the word roots are, where the lines of poems spring from. Isn't it bacteria that turned the water into wine? To thy high requiem become a sod. Scatological belongings, we transmit literature through toilets. The turf is soaked with the metaphors of our country. The turf translates bones not to be broken, the gas of our ancestors. It is a bomb. It sizzles. Do you see a mulberry tree in a mustard seed? We immigrants, we like to carry things. We don't easily throw away cheese wrappers and glass jars from our country. And you might wonder what those silly attachments stand for. And I think they stand for something much greater, for our desire to belong and our desire not to lose our identity. But I think they actually stand for something deeper, for desire itself, which is like a giant in a solitary field, to paraphrase Giacomo Leopardi, an Italian romantic poet. So if we end up smuggling things, it's because we carry infinity in our underpants.
Thank you so much, Ewa. So what was at stake? Like, is the sausage going to make it through security? I want to know. Like, so she builds the tension for us. She did a fantastic job of building the tension of whether or not the sausage is going to get through security. And so that's what's presumably at stake for her is the sausage, but also what's at stake for her is her identity, bringing her identity with her. And so that's how you can, when you're telling your own story, set the stakes, let people know what's important to you, what matters to you. We knew that sausage meant the world to Ewa, and we also knew it meant about something much larger. So thank you again so much, Ewa. And then now, and indeed, buy her book. And then now, Gwendolyn is going to shed light on theme.
Most gumbo recipes start with the roux. That's how it begins, with the roux. And this is very important because it is the foundation of the entire dish. Roux is the flour that is browned, either with animal fats or oil or butter to have the flavor, to have the fullness of the gumbo. And this is in every dish. Just like roux in gumbo, Madeira and Pops are my foundation. Just thinking about my parents, I can hear my mother's laugh. I can see her smile. And I can smell Pops cooking in the kitchen. In the 50s, we lived in the projects, wore secondhand clothes, hand-me-downs, except for the times when Grandpa Buster and Granny Harden bought new clothes and sent them north to Milwaukee, Wisconsin from Kansas City, Missouri, in brown cardboard boxes tied with yards and yards of twine and tape. My siblings and I, we were taught to share with one another, as well as share with those who had less than us. Now, I didn't understand that. I did not understand that. You see, my Pops, he worked 3 side jobs, along with working at International Harvester, which laid him off often. Yet my parents would share a half a loaf of bread when we only had one. They fed 7 children, but always had room for one more when that one more showed up at our door. Now, we kids, we tried very hard to get rid of the person before the table was set. We knew that they only showed up at mealtime. We thought our parents didn't know this, but they knew. They knew that he or she had less than we did. We kids didn't get less to eat. Madeira and Pops got less. There in the projects, unlike our friends, well, we could have company in our house. Oh, yes. Now, the Quezaire house was the house to be at in the neighborhood. You see, my pop, he would pop corn in a heavy skillet with corn oil and shake that pot over the flame on the stove. And he also made chili. Not New England chili, but Creole chili. Andouille sausage, chunks of chicken, onion, celery, garlic, green bell pepper, tomatoes, and plenty of spices. Oh, yeah. And Mama, my dear, she made the champagne. Now, you know what that is? If you know what it is, shout it out. Kool-Aid. She made Kool-Aid, not in a pitcher full, but in a 10-gallon crock pot. Oh, yeah. Now, sometimes we would play cards, bid whiz, pity pat, tunk, spades, or we would play board games like Chinese checkers, Parcheesi, Monopoly. Now, Monopoly, we made up our own rules. Sometimes we would start it on a Friday and got finished on Saturday. Or we turn on the hi-fi, and we would dance to the sounds of Ray Charles, John Lee Hooker, Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, and my man, Little Richard. Oh, my parents. I remember my sister and I sitting on my dear's bed with our legs crossed and our hands in our laps. And my dear told us stories of how she grew up. She told stories of unfulfilled dreams. And she told us how to act like a lady, with our heads held high, our backs straight, and our stomachs sucked in. Mama taught us how to keep our mind and our body clean, and how to keep the boys away from our clean, precious bodies. Pops, a man of few words, avid reader, word collector. Oh, he loved puzzles. Integrity, his trademark. When I was 10 years old, Pops made out a list for me to go to the grocery store. And he told me how much money I would have after I bought the groceries. So I went to the store, I bought the groceries, and I returned home with the same amount of money as when I left. I knew the clerk miscounted, but I said nothing. I thought to myself, well, I would have some extra money, and Pops would be proud of me. Wrong, wrong, wrong. My Pops marched me back to that store, made me apologize to the clerk, return the money, and I had privileges taken away. Taken away. 60s. Now, I know some of you know about the 60s. You have some stories about the 60s. Well, for me, it was my prom dress. Mud Deer's creative genius went to work, and she made me this beautiful dress. Not with a Vogue pattern, or butterick, or simplicity. With her eyes and the knowledge in her head, she made me this beautiful prom dress. I still have it. I can't get in it, but I still have it. That dress was on exhibit in a museum in Connecticut, the Prudence Crandall Museum. That's how beautiful that dress is. When I think about my parents, it's not always about the times in the 50s or 60s. In 1989, my marriage ended. My world was torn apart. My father picked me up at my house. He held his arms around me, and my body cried in pain. Papa took me to the house, and he sat me down in his chair in the kitchen. Now, nobody sits in Papa's chair, but he sat me in his chair. And he filled a pot of water, and he put it on the stove and heated it just right. And then he came back, placed the water on the floor in front of me. And on his knees, my Papa removed my shoes and my socks. And he placed my feet, oh, so gently, in the water. And as my feet soaked, I poured out my fears and my anxieties. And my Papa, he made a meal. And finally, he returned, got on his knees, and 1 foot at a time, he took out, dried my feet, poured olive oil on, and rubbed my feet. My pops, my Papa, told me without a word how much he loved me, and that I have a family, and I would not go through that trauma alone. Mud Deer and Pops, my rule, my foundation, my seasoning for life. And I thank you.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. And we can see in Gwendolyn's story that the focus and the theme for her is that theme of family, of her parents' love for her. So every detail that she included in that story was all about the love that she had for her parents and her parents had for her. And she created a wonderful metaphor of Rue, the Rue being the foundation, and her parents and the love she has for her parents as the foundation of her life, guiding her through not only the tough times and the good times, but really shaping her and getting her through her life. And on our final story is Jordan. And Jordan is going to illustrate for us a narrative arc, who he is at the beginning and who he is at the end.
As a musician, one of the most important parts of my job is to know what to play and when. To be able to read a room or a situation and to find the music that is appropriate for it. And I always used to think that I wasn't too bad at this, but 11 years ago, standing on a windswept hilltop in Ireland, in the middle of an ancient circle of standing stones, I learned otherwise, and I discovered that music can sometimes be much bigger than the person who is attempting to play it. This circle of stones was far from the usual tourist routes. I had had to walk and to hitchhike for several days to reach it. And when I finally got there, there were no signs, there was no one charging admission, there were no gates or fences or anything like that. In fact, as I walked up this hill and stepped between the stones into the circle, there was absolutely nobody else around. Dusk was starting to set in. It looked like it might start to rain at any moment. And I, due to, let's say, a youthful lack of preparation, I wasn't entirely sure where I was going to be sleeping that night. So I was tired, I was hungry, I was chilly, and honestly, I was a little freaked out. Furthermore, while I had been raised on magical stories by writers like C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, I thought, naturally, that as a young man at this point, I had long ago outgrown any belief in real-world magic. But as I was standing there in this ancient place, I found it a little hard to remember that, and I can tell you that the real world itself seemed very far away. Now, I had my fiddle with me, and after sort of soaking in the energy of the place for a few minutes, I decided I felt like I needed to play something. So I opened up the case, and I took out the fiddle, and I raised it to my shoulder, only to discover, to my surprise, that I had absolutely no idea what to play. None of the pieces that I would normally turn to seemed like they were going to be appropriate. One of the things that I've always loved about Celtic music in particular is the wide range of emotions that can be expressed with it. On the one side, you have these lively, lilting jigs and reels that are just packed with joy and celebration. It's the kind of music that makes you want to get up and dance. I'll give you an example. This is a tune called Mason's Apron. This is one of the first Celtic pieces that I ever learned when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and it helped steer me toward the music that would eventually become my career. Thank you. Thank you. So that's a fun piece, right? That's a great little tune, but I couldn't play that on this hill. I cringe at the thought of playing a song like that in this particular setting. It would have felt terribly inappropriate or even insulting somehow to the much more solemn energy of this place that I found myself in. So, if not that, what about something from the other end of the spectrum? What about a sad song, or at least a more solemn, more thoughtful piece of music? The one that came to mind was a piece that I wrote for my grandfather when he passed away. This is a song that, well, I obviously wrote it in a place of feeling quite sad. It has not always been interpreted as strictly a sad piece of music. I have been asked to play it at a lot of funerals over the years, but I've also, oddly enough, been asked to play it at far more wedding ceremonies. Right? So, jokes aside, there's something interesting about that. How can the same piece of music be so appropriate to play around the grave of someone who's just passed away, but also be the right choice for a bride as she walks down the aisle? And what this taught me, upon much reflection, trying to puzzle this out, is that while some pieces of music certainly can be simply classified as happy or sad, some are a little bit more complex than that, and can serve more as amplifiers of whatever emotion it is that the listener is already experiencing. So this seemed like a pretty good option in this case. Let me play you a piece of this one. This is called Charlie Murray's Waltz. Thank you. It wasn't going to cut it. I couldn't even bring myself to play the first note because I knew, without even raising the bow to the strings, I knew that it was going to fall flat and that it was potentially going to seem even more inappropriate than the happy song because it would be, in a sense, trying to match the serious, somber vibe of this place and would therefore insult it all the more by coming up short. So I'm standing there and I'm running through in my head all of the most serious, heavy, thoughtful pieces I can come up with. Major key, minor key, fast, slow, written hundreds of years ago, written by myself just recently, and none of them are going to work. At best, they were going to come across as thin or weak or contrived, and at worst, they were going to be unforgivably irreverent in this place. So I found that as I'm standing there by myself with no one else around, no audience around except myself and these silent standing stones in the circle around me, that I simply did not have what it was going to take to perform here, and I could not bring myself to raise the bow to the strings. And that's when the wind came up. It blew in off the ocean. It swept up the sides of the hill. It passed between the standing stones and over my fiddle, where it was resting on my shoulder. You know the sound that it makes when you blow over the top of a bottle, that sort of low, fluty sound? Well, it did that across both of the holes in the top of the instrument, causing the whole thing to resonate. And it also whistled through all the tiny little holes here in the bridge, with the sound like wind trying to get through the crack in a window, except many times over. It also began to vibrate all four strings simultaneously, so that they started humming not only with their intended pitches, but also with these high ringing harmonics that I had never heard before. It created this very soft but incredible, complex music, and it was perfect. I didn't have what it was going to take to perform in a place. This place needed something more profound than anything that I could provide. And so the place itself was providing it. And I found that all I had to do was listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. I mean, a story and some amazing music at the same time. I mean, come on. And it's just a fantastic narrative arc. It's this wonderful change from him really appreciating music, obviously giving his life to it, and then realizing that actually he wasn't in charge of the music was in charge of him in some way, right? And as he said in the story, that the music was more than the musician. And that shift in learning that and realizing that and making that emotional journey is what makes that story so powerful that Jordan takes us along with it. So those are our 3 stories tonight. Thanks again to all the storytellers. And I really want to encourage all of you to tell your stories, because stories are what connect us. It's what connect us. And as people have said earlier tonight, it's also stories teach us empathy. And it's really hard not to like someone or to demonize them if you know their story, because more than likely it's your story too. And if we tell our stories and we listen to other people's stories, it makes us better people. And if we're better people, we can create better communities. And so I really encourage you to tell stories and listen to stories. And I also encourage you to keep supporting the humanities, because they're doing amazing, amazing work. These people are all about, discovery and civil discourse and connecting us with ideas. And that takes a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm and imagination. And it takes cash. So I encourage all of you to give generously whatever you have, and really just support the great work that the Humanities is doing to make New Hampshire such a great state as well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Anthony, one more time, thank you.